Friends, to introduce this subject, do we talk too much? I wish to introduce a domestic problem that has been sent to me. It comes from a little girl named Mary Lou in Downers Grove, Illinois. My father makes us keep quiet while you are on television. And my father wishes that you were on an hour and a half. Wait until you hear the reason. So the house would be quiet. I like your show, but when we want to see a show, he's always talking. So how can we make him keep quiet when we want to see a show? Mary Lou, you pick out a show that you like, a half-hour show, and every time your father talks, make him send me a dime for the poor of the world. We're not going to emphasize tonight, we're going to pass it over very quickly, about the slur on women that they talk too much. And that only apropos of a story of Immanuel Kant, who was a German philosopher who lived in the 18th century. And he was a very dry professor, never outside of Königsberg in his life. He had only one story. He told it every year in identically the same class. And the new group of students always laughed. And this was the joke of Kant. Immanuel Kant said there were no women in heaven, because sacred scripture says there was silence there for half an hour. But we are concerned with talking, however, in a much bigger sort of way, namely in the sense of superactivity and a want of an interior life. Ulcers happen to be an American disease, and probably because we are so very active. I wonder if ulcers do not vary in direct proportion to the number of keys a man has on his key ring and the number of telephones on his desk. Could be. And we work in order to get cash, in order to buy food, in order to get strength, to go to work again. Where's our leisure? And now, if you notice, even magazines have articles that are supposed to be articles on subjects like relaxation. They'll have at the top reading time, 8 minutes and 30 seconds. Can't waste a minute. Must always be active. The world is to be remade by reorganization, activity. I actually know a man here in New York. This is really true. When he goes out for a walk, he puts an alarm clock in a little suitcase. And he walks till the alarm clock goes off, and then he turns around and starts back home again. Now, of course, this love of superactivity is carried to an extreme in communism, because in America at least, there's no contempt of contemplation, or quiet, or repose, or silence. But with the communists there is. First of all, they cannot allow their minds, the Soviet minds, to have any contact with the outside world, because if a Soviet mind is quiet and silent and contemplative, it may ask itself, why am I here? Why was I born? What is the purpose of life? He's told by the Soviets he has no other purpose than to serve Soviet society. And hence, when the Soviets went to the Geneva Conference, a whole group of them went into a Soviet hotel, and they registered not by name, but by number. So no one could call them on the phone, so no one would know in what room they were. One of them came down to breakfast one particular morning, and a group of the Soviet representatives were in the dining room. There was one American newspaper man off in the corner of the table. And this Soviet came down late, The only free place was with the American newspaper man. As soon as he sat down with the American newspaper man, a hush fell over the dining room. All spoons and knives and forks dropped, and all eyes were turned on him. He left his coffee and went back to his room. It was a warning, no association. You must only think and be active for the Soviets. Hence their hatred of any kind of contemplation, which they call solitary rumination. Organize mass meetings in order to keep a man from that quiet in which he might discover his destiny. In contemplation, a man might measure himself by something else besides Soviet society. He might be concerned as to why God made him. This is the extreme. But the fact is that our whole world today is suffering from a want of inner quiet and repose, soul requiem, and contemplation. We have been living on moral fact for the last century or more. And if our world today is not producing great leaders, it is simply because they have not given themselves to any interior development. It used to be that great heroes came out of society. Society had the kind of an atmosphere that begot a hero. Today it is the heroes that have to create a society. Some years ago, a person that was abnormal mentally could be sustained by society because society itself was sound. Today he cracks because society itself is nervous, so activated that it cannot give any quiet counsel. There's another philosophy of life besides this superactivity of which we've spoken and this hatred of quiet like communism. As a matter of fact, these are the two philosophies of life. One of them is this. It is the divine. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh. First the idea, then the action. First the blueprint, then the building. First the model, the idea, then the sculpture. But Goethe, the German poet, turned it around. In the beginning is the deed. In the beginning is the deed. Then the rationalization of the deed. Then the justification. First you do something, then you analyze it. First the building, then you inquire whether or not it should be built. If leadership is ever to be returned to the world, the primacy must be given to ideas, to thoughts, to contemplation, rather than to deeds. We do talk too much. The result is we're fagged out, we're exhausted spiritually and intellectually all over the world. This is extremely important. That is why our blessed Lord said, for example, that it is not what enters a man that defiles him, it is what comes out of a man. For out of his heart there come lust, jealousy, hatred, evil, and folly. Our heart starts with some kind of spiritual education, or at least a want of it. It's the kind of mill. And if you put wheat into a mill, flour will come out. If you put gravel in, sand or smaller pieces of gravel will come out. And what is already in the heart is the source of action. It is said, it makes no difference what you believe, it all depends upon how you act. No! You act upon your beliefs. Hence the importance of having a right philosophy of life, and a few definite principles to guide life. Our heart is a forge, and on that forge we hammer out the actions of our daily life. You've been in caves and you've seen these stalactites hanging from the tops of caves. They were formed by little drops of water, till finally sometimes they became pillars to support the roofs. That's what our thoughts are, and they congeal into actions. We are made with the inside. Hence the importance also of realizing that whether or not we receive truth depends to a great extent upon the condition of our heart, and the principles, and the goals, and the destinies that we've marked out for ourselves. There's a Latin principle that is very, very fruitful. It is quid recipitur, recipitur promotum recipientis. For the benefit of the three of you in the United States who have forgotten your Latin, it means that whatever is received according to the manner of the one receiving it. For example, suppose I have a glass of water here, and a pitcher of water, and I pour water into a black glass, then into a blue glass, and then into a green glass. It looks black in one instance, look blue in another, red, green, whatever the color happens to be. You taste certain food. If your tongue is coated, food does not taste right. If the mind is coated, truth is not received as it should be. Why is it, for example, that any kind of a truth, a divine truth, for example, suppose you present a divine truth to a Mr. A and to a Mr. B. Why is it that though the same truth is presented, Mr. A will receive it and Mr. B will not receive it? He will reject it. It's because of something that he already has in his own heart. Comedian looks at a television show of a competitor. If he's jealous of that competitor, if he's envious, nothing that he does is going to be good. Nothing. That's because of his philosophy of life. So, what we have to do in order to develop the right philosophy is to have some leisure. Now, the Greek word for leisure is that's the Greek word for leisure. The Latin word for leisure is that. The English word for leisure why leisure? Not idleness, leisure. Why? Because you need leisure for contemplation, because you need leisure to think. That's the meaning of a school, where one is not concerned about other things, where one has time for quiet, in order to decide, first of all, why he's living. There are areas of silence in this country. We are supposed to be a very materialistic country, but we are also a country that loves quiet. And though it be not generally known, throughout this country there are a number of areas, little isolated spots, where there are young men, wise men, former doctors and lawyers and actors, who have joined a community called the Trappists. I once gave a retreat in the Trappist monastery a few years ago. There were 202 men in that monastery. They observed quiet all the time, perpetual silence, except when they speak to the superior. They have little signs for communicating with one another. They want to do that. For example, they want bread, flat. This is the superior, the head. This is today, this is tomorrow. They want wine, they have a rather interesting, humorous gesture. Red nose. And the gesture for a woman is the indication of a veil across the forehead. But sometimes they do that. They get up at 2 o'clock in the morning, except on Sundays, feast days, holidays, holy days. Then they get up at 1. They're on their knees then until 4 o'clock. Meditation, contemplation. And then at 4 o'clock, they hear Mass. And at 6 o'clock, they have breakfast. I don't know why they ever call it breakfast, but they do. It's so small. They have to study about 4 hours a day, and they have to work in the field at least 4 hours a day. They go to bed at 7 or 8 o'clock, depending upon the season. You cannot imagine a happier crowd of men in all the world than these men. They're always smiling. If you could sneak up in back of them and pull the cowl back and look under them when they're at prayer, you'd see a smile. I can remember when I was in the seminary, and also when I visited seminaries, the prefects of discipline are always severe. If a seminarian boy comes in late, the prefect always gives them, look, 92X Form 2. But down there, I could remember the conference, some of the monks would be hurrying in from the fields in order to get in for the conference. Incidentally, my first conference there was 4 o'clock in the morning. And they would be hurrying in from the fields, pulling the scapular up over their heads, and I remember some of them bumping into the superior, and they both look at one another and smile. It was something very funny. And I can remember one day during the retreat, I said to the Father Abbot, there were about 12 or 15 young men who had just come in. They had not, I suppose, been in the monastery over a month. They were not yet given their habits, their garments, their distinguishing garb. And I said to the abbot afterward, one of the talks, one of those men is not going to stay. He said, which one do you think is not going to stay? I said, the fourth from the front on the right-hand side. He said, that's right, he's not going to stay. He said, I'm going to tell him at the close of this retreat that he has to leave. He said, but why do you think he's not going to stay? I said, you know, today while I was talking and on other occasions, I always had the impression that he was giving me a mental reprimand. If ever I would say anything light, I could feel his scolding coming to me. How dare you say anything light? We're serious men. We're given to contemplation. There must be no joy here. Nothing but sadness. This is a place of death. I said, he never smiled. He says, that's the reason I'm sending him away. They've got a wonderful sense of humor. They will, of course, they all could talk to me, and believe me, they wanted to talk when they came in. And one of them came in and he said, I had a great training in music before I came in. And he said, as you know, there's not much emphasis here on choir. They sing 4 hours a day, incidentally, in their office. There's not much emphasis here on choir. And he says, I have a monk next to me. He said he couldn't carry a key on a ring. And he said, you don't know, he says, what I go through listening to that man sing. Now, he says, we have another monastery. It's up in Rhode Island. And he said, there they put much greater emphasis on the choir and on proper liturgical music. And he said, do you think that I ought to ask for a change? in order to go to this other monastery, he said, where I could certainly pray better because I wouldn't have this man alongside of me. And I said to him, would you like me to become a Trappist? He said, yes. I said, did you ever hear me sing? And would you like to have me next to you in choir? Yes. He said, all right. He said, I'll stay. I understand. And one can get a very false impression talking to them, because it is amazing when you go about and talk to people, the more spiritual people are, the more spontaneous is their response and the more they enjoy lightness. Sometimes you make the most innocent remark and they roar. I remember once I mentioned Moses, and everybody broke into a roar, and I went to the Father Abbot afterwards. I said, why does everybody laugh when I say Moses? He said, you'll find out. So finally one man came in, and I said to him, where in heaven's name did you get all this fat? He said, what do you mean fat? I said, what do you weigh, 180 pounds? He said, yes, but I used to weigh 260 before when I came in. I said, what's your name? He says, Moses. Now, I'm not advising that everybody join the Trappists, no, but I am saying this. In the beginning is the Word, quiet and contemplation for the sake of the soul, and then the deeds will be better. I know a priest who, about 38 years ago, decided to spend 1 hour a day in contemplation before our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. He's had some measure of spiritual influence. It was certainly not on account of his brains, because other priests have as much or more brains than he has. He has been able to draw some souls closer to the good Lord. And it certainly was not because of his talents, because he has not been too richly endowed by the good Lord. But I believe that the secret of his power is that in the midst of a busy, active world, that man, in addition to Mass and Rosary, spends an hour in the presence of his Eucharistic Savior, in quiet, preparing for action. I think maybe he's found the secret that we all could apply. For how can a man ever send forth sparks unless he stays near the flame?
People of all faiths recognize Bishop Fulton J. Sheen as one of the greatest communicators of the 20th century. He was born in El Paso, Illinois, in May of 1896. As a young boy, he knew he wanted to be a priest. He served as an altar boy at St. Mary's Cathedral in Peoria, Illinois. At St. Viator College, his education and debating skills taught him the skills he used throughout his life.
Meet him at the airport, and they had a very warm embrace, and he was looking over her shoulder as he embraced her, and he says, "Oh, there goes Kitty McCoy." And the wife said, "Who is she?" Oh, he said, "She was the stewardess on our flight." She said, "How did you know her name?" Oh, he says, "The names were up on the bulletin board. Pilot, co-pilot, stewardess." She said, "What was the pilot's name?" This telecast is not going to be what you think it is. I know you've heard the song, "Love is a many splendored thing," but I'm going to tell you the origin of that expression. a many-splendored thing. I'm going to tell you who really wrote it, but I will tell you in a minute. It is a very interesting life because it's somewhat related to our age, in which there is a fondness for flight from consciousness. What is there, anyway, in human nature that makes it rather anxious to evade and escape consciousness and responsibility? Alcohol, dope, sleeping tablets, whatever they happen to be. A way to avoid the responsibility of being awake. And I'm going to tell you the story of a man who had a flight from consciousness. And in this story, we find revealed the unconscious influence of little things. Jean Guiton, a member of the French Academy, said that while he was a prisoner of the Nazis in Germany, one night he and a number of other prisoners amused themselves by each telling how his mother and father met. Circumstances were quite accidental. Sale of a lottery ticket, chance meeting, fall on the street, blind date, wrong address. And here, as a result of these trivial things, here were men that were prisoners under a totalitarian system. It was the little thing that influenced the life of Francis Thompson, who wrote, "Love is a many-splendored thing." And what was that small thing? Well, this young man started for the priesthood, and he was told he did not have a vocation. And then he went into medicine. His fondness was literature. He used to produce as a little boy the plays of Shakespeare for his sisters. And as he was studying medicine in the University of Manchester, he roamed into every bookstore, and at that particular time there had just appeared a Life of De Quincey. He evidently had mentioned the fact that at home that he loved De Quincey. And on his 17th birthday, his mother gave him De Quincey's famous work, The Confessions of an Opium Eater. And his 17-year-old eyes fell upon this line of De Quincey. Why, at the age of 17, should I have become a prisoner and a prey to this drug, and lost my mind and my freedom? The mother never intended that her son Francis Thompson should ever follow in the steps of Thomas De Quincey. But he did. So he went in for the psychedelic, for the flight from the unconscious. And here there's a curious parallel between the life of De Quincey and the life of Thompson. De Quincey lived earlier than Thompson. When De Quincey became a dope fiend, he went to London, to Soho Square. So did Thompson. And this further parallel, when they went to Soho Square, De Quincey had in his pocket a book of English poetry, we do not know which poet it was, and a copy of the Greek dramatist Euripides. When Thompson went, he had in one pocket Blake, and in the other pocket Sophocles. When they went to London, they both went to the same place, Soho Square. How well I know it. I've spent 5 years of my life in Soho Square. Not continuously, but many, many summers and many winters during my university days. It acquired its name in the 17th century because that was the area of London where the huntsmen used to gather to chase the hounds. And the head huntsman would call the hounds with Soho. It became known as Soho Square. It's very famous. Just a block away is Greek Street. That's where Karl Marx lived for a third of his life, in great poverty. This founder of communism, his wife said, "Karl, if you had only made more capital instead of writing about it, the whole world would have been better off." I had many experiences there in Soho Square with the type of person, of course, that Thompson actually is and was. But here are the two of them, decades apart, roamed the street. Thompson made a little money here and there, chasing cabs, holding a horse, selling matches, running an errand. Just a bum. A bum. Emaciated and thin, and drugged and hunger. No one was there to befriend him except a woman of the streets. And one wonders, in all of literature, if there ever was a greater tribute paid to a woman of the street than Thompson paid this woman. He wrote about her in a poem to Monica Meynell. We will tell you about the Meynells in a moment. And this is his description. Then there came past a child like thee, a spring flower, fallen from the budded coronal of spring. A spring flower, fallen from the budded coronal of spring. And through the city streets blown withering, she passed, oh brave, sad, lovingest, tender thing, and of her scant pittance did she give, that I might eat and live. Then fled a swift and trackless fugitive. The same thing happened to De Quincey. When he was in the depths of poverty and degradation, a woman of the streets befriended him. We know her name. Her name was Anne. Thompson, or rather St. Augustine, never gave the name of the woman with whom he lived before he was converted. Thompson never gave the name of this one. But he went out and searched for her. Now, why he searched is interesting. He gathered up in dusty old, dirty papers an article and a few poems, and he sent them to Wilfred Meynell, who was the editor of Merry England. And in the letter to Wilfred Meynell, he said, "You may return the manuscript and the rejection slip to Francis Thompson, Charing Cross, Post Office, General Delivery." He never heard for 9 months. So in those 9 months, he went into despair.
He wanted to find this woman. He could not do it. She said to him as she left, "You are always a genius. You're above me." And sinking lower and lower, he then took up his residence in Covent Garden. Covent Garden, at one end in London, was the Opera House. Down the street, Maiden Lane Church. You go down 2 or 3 steps to go into it. Wish we had an hour and a half. I would tell you about an interesting character that I met there. But in television, you get time in segments. And then in front of the opera was Covent Garden. Covent Garden was where all of the produce of England was brought every morning. So in those days of Thomson was born in 1859. In those days, there were 2-wheeled carts, horses, baskets, dirt, and refuse. And he used to sleep under those carts, being awakened by the pounding of the horses' hoofs. And I wonder if anyone, ever weary of life, ever penned such lines as these. Forlorn and faint and stark, I had endured the watches of the dark and the abashless inquisition of each star. The abashless inquisition of each star. Yea, was the outcast mark of all those heavenly passers' scrutiny. Stood bound and helpless for time to shoot its barbed minutes at me. Suffered the trampling hoof of every hour in night's slow-wheeled car, until the tardy dawn, dragging me at length from under those dread wheels, and bled of strength, I awaited the inevitable last. So he decided to take his life. And he'd saved up his pennies, bought enough of dope to kill himself. Under these wheels, he could see a distant clock on the spire of a church. It was that prompted him to say that time was shooting its barbed minutes at him. He took half of the dope, and he felt a hand on his that held him back from the fatal other half. He said it was the hand of Chatterton, a poet that had lived 100 years before. He gave up the attempt at suicide, and the next day, news came to him that Wilfred Meynell wanted to see him. The 9 months had passed. Now begins a kind of change of life. Wilfred Meynell attempts a cure, sends him out to the Abbey of Storrington. And here we enter into a new phase of his life. His love of children. And as he roamed about the fields of Storrington, he met a little girl whose name was Daisy Stanford. And this is what he wrote of Daisy. Here she came with a few tokens, raspberries, and such things, and he said that his own heart went down to her hand. But her beauty smoothed earth's furrowed face. She gave me tokens 3. A look, a word of her winsome mouth, and a raspberry. The fairest things have fleetest end. Their scent survives their close. But the rose's scent is bitterness to him that loved the rose. We will continue in a moment. How often an adult will have an inexpressible love for a sweet child? It's unreciprocated. They do not know they're loved. And this is Thompson's pain. She went her unrepentant way. She went and left with me the pang of all the partings gone, and the partings yet to be. She left me marveling why my soul was sad, that she was glad. Had all the sadness in the sweet, and the sweetness in the sad. And then he ends. Nothing begins, nothing ends. It is not paid with moan, for we are born in others' pain and perish in our own. The love went out from his life. But then he found some solace in little Olivia Meynell. Sweet little child, but here was his life spoiled. And with the pillaring hours about to crush him, he seemed afraid of this beautiful innocence. And he wrote, I fear to love thee, sweet, because love's the ambassador of loss. Love's the ambassador of loss. White flake of childhood, clinging so to my soiled raiment, thy shy snow at tenderest touch will shrink and go. Love me not, delightful child, my heart by man's snares beguiled has grown timorous and wild. It would fear thee not at all, wert thou not so harmless, small, because thy arrows, not yet dire, are still unbarbed with destined fire. I fear thee more than hadst thou stood full panoplied in womanhood. And all the while, he's being haunted by something. And I told you of that poem of haunting. I gave it to you one year, The Hound of Heaven, that he wrote. He went back again to dope. The Meynell still cared for him. But this hound was pursuing him. But despite this shell, that shell that first came to the Meynells, he had no stockings on and his toes were out through his shoes and dirty old brown coat, no shirt. Consumptive, because of the nights he slept under the cartwheels of London. He still had this love that pulled him. Probably that was pulling him at the beginning of his life, and so he wrote, O world invisible, we view thee. O world intangible, we touch thee. O world unknowable, we love thee.